At the Thanksgiving party in front of 30 guests, my daughter suddenly set down her wine glass and smiled. "Dad, if you still want to live here, you should start paying rent," her husband laughed. "Exactly. Adults should take care of themselves." The room went completely silent. No one defended me. No one dared to look me in the eye. I simply nodded and walked into my study. At 11:47 p.m. I made 3 phone calls, and by sunrise everything they thought belonged to them had already begun to disappear. I'm truly grateful you're here with me today. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Your city, your country, I'd love to know. And just so you know, this story contains some fictional elements woven in for entertainment and reflection. Any similarity to names or places is purely coincidental, but every lesson inside it, that part is all yours to keep. The turkey had been in the oven since 5 in the morning. I was the one who put it there. Not the caterer Diana had offered to hire, not the personal chef Brandon had casually suggested, and certainly not my daughter herself, who hadn't set foot in a kitchen for anything more complicated than reheating leftovers in years. Me, Richard Harmon. 68 years old, still wearing the same flannel shirt I'd had since 2009, standing alone in a kitchen that cost more to renovate than my first truck did to buy. That was Thanksgiving morning, November 27th, 2025. And I remember thinking as I basted that bird for the 3rd time before the sun had fully come up, that Maggie would have laughed at me. She always said I over-basted. She said it was my way of staying busy when I had too much on my mind. She was right about most things. By 7 in the evening, the dining room was full. 32 people seated around the long mahogany table that stretched the entire length of our oceanfront dining room in Newport Beach. Crystal glasses catching the chandelier light. Centerpieces Diana had ordered from a florist in Beverly Hills. The Pacific Ocean dark and restless through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind us. I stood near the kitchen pass-through, refilling a breadbasket, watching. Diana sat at the head of the table in a red dress that probably cost more than Thomas earned in a week. She was laughing at something one of her friends had said, her head thrown back perfectly at ease. Brandon sat beside her in a fitted blazer, one arm draped over the back of her chair, like he owned not just the chair, but the entire house, the entire view, the entire coastline. "This place is unreal," one of their friends said loudly, gesturing toward the window. "Seriously, Diana, how do you live like this?" Diana smiled the way she always smiled when someone said that, like she'd been waiting for the question. "Hard work," she said simply. I set the breadbasket down on the counter and looked at my hands for a moment. These hands. 40 years of calluses. 40 years of early mornings and late nights and decisions that kept 200 employees fed and a company alive through 2 recessions. Hard work. Yes, that was one word for it. Thomas appeared quietly at my elbow. He was 67, had worked for our family for 30 years, and moved through a room the way good people always do without needing to be noticed. He took the breadbasket from me and nodded once toward the table, his eyes asking a question he'd never say out loud. "I'm fine, Thomas," I told him quietly. He looked at me the way only someone who has known you for 3 decades can look at you. Like he didn't believe me, but respected me enough not to argue. The conversation at the table had turned to money, the way it always did when Brandon was in the room. He was leaning forward now, hands moving as he talked about a real estate investment. He was planning some development in Scottsdale, something about projections and equity and timing the market. "The key," Brandon was saying loud enough that the whole table could hear, "is knowing when to move. Most people wait too long. Me, I act. That's why we have what we have." I watched Diana nod beside him, watched her agree with that statement without a flicker of hesitation. What we have. I thought about the deed to this house sitting in a folder in the trust documents I kept locked in my study. Harmon Family Trust. LLC. My name. Not hers, Not his. Mine. Diana had never asked. She'd moved in with Brandon 3 years ago after their wedding, and assumed the way people who have never had to think about these things assume that what surrounded her was hers by proximity, by right of being my daughter. I had let her believe that. That was on me. The conversation shifted. Diana was talking now, telling the table about a new contract. Coastal Ventures had just landed a shipping deal with a distribution company out of Phoenix. Her voice had that particular energy it got when she was performing confidence rather than feeling it. I knew the difference. I'd known it since she was 7 years old. Coastal Ventures is on track for the best quarter we've ever had, she said. I built that company from the ground up and it shows. Something moved behind my ribs. Not anger. Something quieter and more complicated than anger. Then Brandon picked up his wine glass, glanced down the table toward me and grinned. Rich, you must be proud. Your daughter running her own company, this house, the life she's built. He took a long sip. She doesn't need anyone taking care of her anymore. 32 pairs of eyes drifted toward me. Some politely curious, some already bored, already looking back at their plates. I opened my mouth to say something ordinary, something that would let the moment pass. I didn't get the chance. Diana set her wine glass down with a sharp, deliberate click that cut through every other sound in the room. When she looked at me, her chin was raised, her expression perfectly composed, and her voice was calm in the way that a scalpel is calm. Dad, she said. Since we're talking about real things, I've been thinking. If you want to keep living here, you should probably start contributing. Pay rent like any other adult who shares a space. The table went completely still. Brandon let out a short laugh. Not a nervous laugh, an entertained one. Exactly. Grown adults take care of themselves. I looked around the table. 30 people. Some had their eyes down. Some were suddenly very interested in their food. My cousin Ellen, sitting 3 seats away, gave a small, uncomfortable cough. Not one person said a word in my direction. Not one. The clock above the fireplace ticked. I had built this house with my own hands. Not figuratively. I had stood on this lot in 2003 with the architect and the foreman and pointed to where I wanted every wall. I had written the check. I had signed the deed over to the trust. I had chosen these windows because Maggie said she wanted to fall asleep to the sound of the ocean. I set down the serving spoon I hadn't realized I was still holding. I folded the dish towel over the counter. I straightened up slowly, because 68-year-old knees creak whether you want them to or not. Thank you all for coming, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. It's a beautiful evening. I turned and walked down the hall toward my study. Behind me, I heard Brandon say something that made 2 or 3 people laugh. I heard the conversation restart the way conversations do when an awkward moment gets buried under more wine and louder voices. I closed the study door behind me. The room was dark. I didn't turn on the light. I stood there for a moment with my hand still on the doorknob, and I thought about Maggie, and I thought about 40 years, and I thought about a metal box we used to keep under a bed in a 400-square-foot apartment in Queens, where we put every dollar we didn't spend that week because we believed with everything we had that if we were patient enough and worked hard enough, we could build something real. We did build something real, and tonight I finally understood what I had to do with it. The house was quiet by 10:30. I heard Brandon and Diana go upstairs, their voices low, a little too clipped with each other, the way voices get after a dinner that doesn't land the way anyone planned. A door closed, then another, then nothing but the sound of the ocean through the windows and the occasional tick of the house settling around me in the dark. I was still in my study, still hadn't turned on the light. My father used to say that the best decisions he ever made, he made in the dark. Not metaphorically, literally. He said the dark forced you to be honest with yourself because there was nothing else to look at. I used to think that was just an old man's eccentricity. Sitting there that night, I understood what he meant. I got up, went to the window, and looked out at the Pacific. The water was black and enormous, and indifferent, the way the ocean always is when you need it to be something other than indifferent. I stood there for a while, just breathing. Then I went to my desk, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a folder. It was a slim thing, dark blue. I'd put it together quietly over the previous 6 weeks, not because I knew this night was coming exactly, but because I had felt it coming the way you feel a weather change in a bad knee. Some part of me had been preparing, and that part of me had been right. Inside the folder were 4 things. A listing printout for a 47-acre private island in the Florida Keys, which I had bookmarked in September after seeing it mentioned in a real estate briefing. An internal asset summary from Harmon Family Trust, detailing every property, every vehicle, every financial instrument held under the trust, none of which had Diana's name on them, because I had never transferred anything to her name, and she had never once asked. A contact sheet for Eleanor Voss, our family's attorney for 22 years, and a handwritten note I'd made to myself 3 weeks earlier that said simply, "When you're ready." I picked up my phone. It was 11:47. I called Walter Ross first. Walter had been with Harmon Global for 19 years, starting as a fleet coordinator when we had 12 trucks and working his way up to chief operating officer. He was 53 years old, precise, loyal, and completely unflappable. He answered on the second ring. "Walter," I said. "Mr. Harmon." No surprise in his voice. No sleep either. I sometimes wondered if Walter ever actually slept. "I've been expecting your call." "You knew?" "I know you," he said. "How bad was it tonight?" I thought about Diana's face when she said it. The flatness in her eyes. The way Brandon laughed. "Bad enough," I said. "I need you to begin the process we discussed. Monday morning, formal notice to the property, full asset review, everything under the trust to be formally assessed." "Understood." A pause. "And the vehicles?" "The Lamborghini first. Brandon's been driving it for 2 years on a company authorization that was always meant to be temporary. Pull it. I'll have the paperwork ready by Sunday night." "Good." I looked down at the listing in my hand. "I also need you to contact the broker for the Florida Keys property. The 47 acres. I want to move forward." There was a longer pause this time. "Mr. Harmon, that's a significant purchase. $28 million cash transaction." "Are you certain?" "Walter," I said. "I've been certain since September. I just needed a reason to stop waiting." He understood. He always understood. "I'll reach out first thing tomorrow morning," he said. "We can have a letter of intent to the seller by end of day." After I hung up with Walter, I called Eleanor Voss. Eleanor was 55, had silver hair she kept cut close to her head, and had a habit of getting directly to the point that I had always admired. She answered with the calm efficiency of someone who had been a lawyer long enough to know that late-night calls from clients were rarely about anything small. "Richard," she said. "Eleanor, I need you to prepare 2 things. First, a formal eviction and non-renewal notice for the Newport Beach property to be issued by the trust, not by me personally, the trust. Second, I want to begin the process of updating my will." A beat. "How significantly are we updating it?" "Significantly," I said. Another beat. "I'll clear my calendar for Tuesday. Come in at 9. I hung up and sat back down at my desk. The folder was still open in front of me. I looked at the island listing one more time. The aerial photograph showed a long crescent of land curving around a natural harbor covered in sea grapes and sable palms, a private dock on the eastern shore. Remote. Protected. Mine if I wanted it. I closed the listing and picked up the handwritten note instead. "When you're ready." I'd been ready for longer than I wanted to admit. The truth was that tonight hadn't surprised me. What surprised me was how little it hurt compared to how much I thought it would. Maybe because I had known somewhere beneath all the love and the hoping and the excusing that Diana had been drifting toward this for years. that the comfort I had provided had slowly become a wall between her and everything she needed to actually become. Maggie had warned me. 5 years ago, lying in a hospital bed with IVs in both arms and less time left than either of us wanted to acknowledge, she had taken my hand and said very clearly in the voice she used when she meant every syllable, "Don't make it too comfortable for her, Rich. The struggle is the point. Promise me you won't take that away from her." I had kissed her forehead and told her Diana would be fine. I had been wrong. I closed the folder, stood up, and walked to the window one more time. The ocean was still there, still black, still moving, the way it always moved without asking anyone's permission, without explaining itself, without apology. I thought about that 47-acre island out there in the warm Florida water. I thought about what I intended to build on it. Not for myself. For people who had given everything and received nothing back. People who understood what it meant to be forgotten by the ones they had done the most for. I understood that feeling now in a way I hadn't this morning. I turned off the study lamp, and in the dark, for the first time in months, I felt something settle inside my chest. Not anger, not grief. Something cleaner than either of those. Clarity. I went to bed at 2 a.m. I slept better than I had in years. By the time Diana came downstairs for her coffee the following morning, the letter of intent for the island had already been sent, and 3 things she had built her life around were already beginning to quietly, irreversibly disappear. While I slept better than I had in months, I also woke up earlier than I had in years, 4:53 in the morning. The ocean outside my window was still dark, still restless, the kind of pre-dawn gray that makes everything look like it's waiting for permission to begin. I lay there for exactly 4 minutes, I know, because I watched the clock, and then I got up, went to the closet, and pulled down the navy blue suitcase from the top shelf. Maggie had given it to me for our 20th wedding anniversary. 1999. She'd wrapped it in brown paper and tied a red ribbon around it, and when I opened it, she had said, laughing, "Because you never go anywhere just for yourself, Rich. Maybe this'll remind you that you're allowed to." 26 years later, I was finally taking her advice. I opened the suitcase on the bed and stood there looking at it for a moment. Then I started to pack. Not much. A few pairs of slacks, 4 flannel shirts, undershirts, socks, the reading glasses I'd started needing 2 years ago, and still resented a weathered copy of Steinbeck's East of Eden that I'd been meaning to finish for 3 years, and the framed photograph of Maggie that lived on my nightstand, the one from 1991, the 2 of us standing in front of the 3rd truck, laughing at something I couldn't even remember anymore, but that had clearly been very funny at the time. I held that photograph for longer than I intended to. "Well," I said to her face in the frame, "here we go." I could have sworn the photograph smiled back. It didn't, obviously. But grief does strange things to a person's perception, and 5 years in, I was still learning which parts of that strangeness to trust. I set the photograph carefully between 2 folded shirts and kept packing. There's something about the physical act of packing a suitcase that strips everything down to essentials. You can't take everything. You have to decide what actually matters. Standing there in that pre-dawn quiet, my hands moving through 40 years of accumulated life, I let myself remember how it had started. Not the polished version I told at dinner parties. The real one. 1985. I was 28 years old and driving a rented Kenworth T600 on a route from Newark to Boston, sleeping in the cab because the daily rate on a motel room would have eaten 3 days of profit. I had $240 in a checking account, and a belief so stubborn it bordered on delusional that I was going to build something. I met Maggie at a truck stop diner in Fairfield, Connecticut, on a Thursday in March. She was behind the counter refilling coffee for a man who looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days. Which he hadn't, because that man was me. "You want pie with that?" she asked, not looking up from the coffee pot. "I want pie," I said, "but I can't afford pie." She looked up then. Brown eyes, direct as a compass needle. She cut me a slice anyway and put it in front of me and said, "On the house. You look like you need it more than we need the $1.50. I ate the pie. I left her a $5 tip I absolutely could not afford. And I thought about her the entire 11 hours back to Newark. We got married 14 months later in a courthouse in Queens with Thomas, then 28 himself, already working for me as a mechanic on that first truck as my witness. Maggie wore a blue dress she'd bought at a consignment shop on 42nd Street. I wore the only suit I owned, which was the one I'd worn to my father's funeral. We had dinner afterward at a diner 3 blocks from the courthouse, and Maggie ordered the pie, and we laughed until the other customers started looking at us. Diana was born the following year in a 400-square-foot apartment in Sunnyside, Queens. I remember the night we brought her home from the hospital, setting her down in the second-hand crib we'd refinished ourselves, Maggie leaning over it with her hair loose and her eyes bright, saying, "Rich, look what we made." I looked. My daughter. Tiny and perfect and completely unaware of how hard everything was, and how much we loved her because of it, and in spite of it. By 1990, we had 3 trucks. By 95, 12. By 2000, we had 40 trucks, a small warehouse in New Jersey, and our first contract with a regional distribution company that felt at the time like the biggest thing that had ever happened to us. Maggie kept the books at the kitchen table while Diana did homework beside her. I remember coming home one night to find them both asleep over their respective work, Maggie's calculator on top of Diana's math homework, and thinking that I was the luckiest man alive. By 2010, Harmon Logistics had 200 vehicles and our first maritime shipping contract out of the Port of Long Beach. By 2015, we were Harmon Global. Offices in Los Angeles, Miami, Houston. A portfolio of contracts that would have been unimaginable to the 28-year-old sleeping in a truck cab on I-95. Maggie never changed. Not once. She still drove herself to the grocery store. Still called her sister in Ohio every Sunday. Still cooked dinner when I came home late, even when I told her she didn't have to. When people at company events found out she was my wife, they always seemed surprised the way people are surprised when something real shows up in a room full of performance. She would just smile and say, "Rich built the company. I just made sure he ate while he did it." She was wrong about that, but I never could convince her otherwise. In March of 2020, she told me her stomach had been bothering her for a while. In April, the doctor said it was pancreatic cancer. In November, 2 days before Thanksgiving, she was gone. The last real conversation we had, not the foggy morphine conversations of the final days, but the last time she was fully herself and fully with me, she took both my hands in hers, and her grip was still surprisingly strong, and she said, "Watch Diana Rich, not because you don't trust her, because she never had to struggle, and I'm afraid of what that means for her." My throat closed so hard it physically hurt. I managed to get out. "She'll be fine, Maggie. She's got your mind." Maggie shook her head slowly. Her eyes were absolutely clear. "She's got your stubbornness, too. Make sure she uses it the right way. Promise me you won't make it too easy." I promised. For 5 years I hadn't kept that promise. I zipped the suitcase closed. The sound of it was quiet and final, like punctuation at the end of a sentence you've been writing for a very long time. I set it by the door, straightened up, and looked around the bedroom one last time. "Okay, Maggie," I said softly to no one and to her simultaneously. "I'm keeping the promise now." My eyes stung. I blinked it back, picked up the suitcase, and walked out of the room. I was dressed and downstairs before 6. The house had that particular early morning quality that big houses get when everyone else is still asleep, a kind of held breath, everything waiting. The kitchen still smelled faintly of last night's dinner. Someone had left a wine glass on the counter that hadn't made it into the dishwasher. I picked it up, rinsed it, set it in the rack out of habit, then caught myself and almost laughed. 30 years of tidying up after other people. Some habits are harder to leave behind than suitcases. I walked through the downstairs slowly. Not sentimentally, I wasn't going to let myself do that, but deliberately. The way you walk through a thing you built when you want to remember exactly what it cost. The living room with its 16-foot ceilings and the custom millwork I'd had installed by a carpenter from Vermont, who had charged an outrageous amount and been completely worth it. The library with its built-in shelves that Maggie had filled herself alphabetically by author over the course of 2 years. The dining room still carrying the ghost of last night's table setting, the centerpieces slightly wilted now in the early light. I stopped in the doorway of the dining room and looked at the chair at the head of the table. Diana's chair now. It had been mine once, and then Maggie's, and then somewhere along the way, without any formal ceremony or conversation, it had become Diana's. I thought about how that had happened. How slowly and naturally and completely invisibly. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Walter Ross. "Good morning," I said. "Mr. Harmon." Walter's voice had that particular quality it got when he was already 3 steps ahead of the current conversation. The Florida Keys broker confirmed receipt of the letter of intent at 11:50 last night. They're reaching out to the seller's representative this morning. We should have a response by end of business today. "Good," I said. "Also," a brief pause. "The trust documents are updated. All asset schedules reflect current holdings. The Newport Beach property, both vehicles registered to Harmon Family Trust, all credit facilities. Everything is clean and documented. The formal review notice can go out Monday as planned." I looked at the dining room chair one more time. "Is her name on anything, Walter? Anything at all?" "No, sir." His voice was matter-of-fact, not unkind. "It never was. You never transferred title on any of it. She's been a resident, not an owner. Legally, the trust has full discretion." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. That was the thing about having built everything through a properly structured trust, a Harmon Family Trust established in 2003, with Eleanor as the drafting attorney, was that it had always been mine to decide. Every property, every vehicle, every financial instrument had gone into the trust, not into anyone's personal name. Diana had lived inside that structure for 3 years, without ever once asking whose name was actually on the deed. I had never lied to her. I had simply never volunteered information she had never sought. "Monday morning, then," I said. "Monday morning," he confirmed. "Safe travels, sir." I found Thomas in the kitchen at 7:15, exactly where he always was at that hour. Standing at the counter, with a mug of black coffee, reading something on his phone, the kitchen already half cleaned from the night before. Thomas Monroe. 67 years old, built like a man who had spent his 20s doing physical work, and his 30s teaching himself everything else. He'd started as a mechanic on my 3rd truck in 1991, and had been with me in one capacity or another for every year since. He looked up when I came in. His eyes went to the suitcase I'd set by the back door. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his eyes went soft in a way that hit me somewhere behind the sternum. "Going somewhere?" he asked. "Florida," I said. For a while, Thomas set down his mug. He looked at me for a long moment, with the expression of a man who had 30 years of context for this conversation and understood every layer of it without needing it explained. "How long is a while?" he said. "Honest answer, I don't know yet." I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "You heard last night." It wasn't a question. Thomas heard everything. That was part of what made him irreplaceable, and part of what I had always felt quietly guilty about, that he had witnessed more of my family's private failures than any man should have to. "I heard," he said, and Thomas picked up his mug again, turned it in his hands. "And I've been waiting for you to do something about it for 2 years, he said quietly. "So has your wife, if she were still here." My chest tightened so hard I had to breathe through it. I pressed my hands flat on the table. "You think I'm doing the right thing?" I think you're finally doing the necessary thing, Thomas said. There's a difference. The right thing would have been 10 years ago. But the necessary thing, he shrugged the kind of shrug that contains an entire argument. Better late than never. I looked at him. This man who had shown up to Maggie's funeral in the only suit he owned and stood in the rain without an umbrella because he'd given it to an elderly woman who didn't have one. This man who had called me every Sunday evening for 5 years, not because his job required it, but because he knew I was alone and he thought I shouldn't be. Take care of yourself while I'm gone, I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. You've carried enough for this family. Thomas's eyes went red at the corners. He pressed his lips together and looked down at his mug. You call me when you land, he said gruffly. I don't care what time it is. I will. He stood up, came around the table, and put his hand on my shoulder, the way men of his generation do when they mean something they can't quite say out loud. I put my hand over his and held it there for a moment. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs. Diana appeared in the kitchen doorway, in her robe hair still loose from sleep, holding her phone against her chest. She stopped when she saw the suitcase. Something shifted behind her eyes, not quite alarm, not quite guilt, something that lived in the uncomfortable space between the two. Dad. Her voice was cautious. What is this? I stood up. Good morning, Diana. Where are you going? On a trip. I picked up my suitcase. Her face did something complicated. She took a step toward me. For how long you didn't say anything last night about… No, I agreed. I didn't. She stopped. Her hand came up to her collarbone the way it had since she was a little girl, when she was trying to figure out what she'd done wrong. Dad, is this about last night? Because if it is, we can talk about it. I didn't mean for it to come out the way it… Diana. My voice was gentle. It surprised us both. This isn't a punishment. This is just something I should have done a long time ago. She opened her mouth, closed it. Her eyes were filling up, though she was fighting it hard, blinking fast, lifting her chin. Send me a text when you land, she said finally, her voice tight and thin. Just so I know you're okay. I looked at my daughter. 38 years old, and still in certain lights the baby I had carried home from the hospital to that tiny Queen's apartment. My heart did something painful and necessary at the same time. When I'm ready to be in touch, I said I will be. I walked to the back door, picked up my suitcase, and stepped outside into the cool November morning. The Pacific was silver in the early light. A pelican was sitting on the dock railing, completely unimpressed by the whole situation. The car Walter had arranged was already waiting at the end of the driveway. A plain black sedan, not a company car. I'd asked for that specifically. No logos, no statements. I didn't look back at the house, not because it didn't hurt. It hurt considerably. But some doors, once you've decided to walk through them, you have to walk through without stopping, or you never finish walking through them at all. The driver, a quiet young man who understood from my expression that this was not a conversation morning, put my suitcase in the trunk without a word. I got in the car. We pulled out of the driveway, and the house disappeared behind the hedgerow, and then it was just the road and the morning and the Pacific glittering away to the west, and somewhere out there past the horizon, an island that was going to become something worth building. I was somewhere over Louisiana when Diana's Monday morning started to come apart. The private charter Walter had arranged left Van Nuys Airport at 6:45 on Saturday morning, November 29th, with a refueling stop in Tampa. By the time I landed at Key West International and took the boat out to the island, it was late Saturday afternoon, and the Florida sun was doing that particular low-angle thing it does in November, turning the water every shade of gold and copper simultaneously. I stood on the dock of what was technically still just a plot of land, with a modest caretaker's cabin on it, and I breathed salt air, and I thought, yes, this is exactly right. Sunday, I spent mostly alone, walking the perimeter of the property, sitting on the eastern shore watching the Atlantic move, eating a sandwich Thomas had packed for me in a brown bag, the way he'd been packing my lunch since 1994, even though I had told him at least 40 times that I was a grown man who could make his own sandwich. Monday came. Walter called at 9:15, which in California was 6:15 in the morning, which meant he had been up since before dawn monitoring the situation. That was Walter Ross, 53 years old COO. For the past 17 of the 19 years, he had been with Harmon Global, constitutionally incapable of sleeping through anything important. It started, he said. I was sitting on the cabin porch with a cup of coffee. A brown pelican was standing on the dock railing 12 feet away, regarding me with the particular expression pelicans have, which is one of absolute philosophical indifference. Tell me, I said. The formal notice was delivered to the Newport Beach property at 8:02 this morning, via certified mail and same-day courier, Walter said. Standard Harmon Family Trust letterhead. No mention of your name. Just the trust, the property address, and the language about formal review of occupancy terms. How did she react? Walter cleared his throat. My contact at the property says she opened it at the door, read it twice, and then called the number on the letterhead immediately. Our trust administrator handled the call. Diana was, he paused, choosing his words, insistent. I imagine she was. She asked who the owner was. Administrator said that information was confidential per trust structure. Diana asked to speak to a supervisor. Administrator transferred her to a recorded line and repeated the same information. Diana asked how this was legally possible. Administrator explained that Harmon Family Trust, LLC, is a properly registered California trust, that all properties held within it are trust assets, and that the occupancy review is within the trust's legal rights under California Property Code. Walter paused again. She hung up before the administrator finished the sentence. I looked at the pelican. The pelican looked back at me. And the cards, I asked. Canceled at 8:30 this morning, Walter said. All three. The Amex Platinum, the Visa Signature, and the MasterCard. All additional cards linked to your primary accounts. Bank confirmed cancellation effective immediately per your standing instruction. I had set that instruction up 3 weeks ago, timed to activate the Monday after Thanksgiving. Walter had thought I was being optimistic about the timeline. I had told him I was being realistic. She tried to use one at 11:47, Walter continued. Nordstrom on Wilshire in Beverly Hills. Then again at 11:49. Then the second card at 11:52. Then the third at 11:54. A beat. The cashier had to tell her 3 times. Something moved in my chest. Not satisfaction. Something much more complicated and much less comfortable than satisfaction. I had raised that girl. I had taught her to ride a bike in a parking lot in Queens when she was 5 years old. I had held her hand in the waiting room when she got her first stitches at age 7 after a bicycle accident that had been entirely my fault for not watching closely enough. Hearing about her standing in a Beverly Hills store with a declined card, people watching, that hurt. It hurt the way setting a broken bone hurts, which is to say, it was painful and also necessary, and also the only way the thing was ever going to heal right. She called your personal number, Walter said. 14 times between 11:58 and 12:30, I can see the log from the company phone system's call records. I know. I had watched the calls come in on my phone and let them go to voicemail. 14 small vibrations, each one a choice I had already made. What did she say when she called you? I closed my eyes briefly. 14 calls to my personal phone, not to the trust administrator, not to the company, not to Eleanor. To me, her father. Did she leave messages? My voice came out steadier than I felt. 12 of them, Walter said. I haven't listened. They're yours. I sat with that for the moment. The coffee had gone lukewarm in my hand. The Pelican decided it had seen enough and launched itself off the dock railing with the lazy, improbable grace that large birds have wings catching air like they had all the time in the world. "What about Brandon?" I asked. "That's where it gets interesting," Walter said, and something shifted in his tone, a slight tightening that I had learned over 19 years to pay attention to. He called the trust number twice this afternoon. Both times he identified himself as Diana's husband and said, and I'm quoting from the recording here, that he was certain there had been a clerical error and that he would appreciate if someone could sort it out quickly because, quote, "We have a lifestyle to maintain." The words landed in the Florida afternoon like a stone dropped into still water. "A lifestyle to maintain." "Walter," I said. "Sir, make sure the vehicle paperwork is ready for tomorrow morning." A pause. Just a fraction of a second, but Walter's pauses were always meaningful. "Already done," he said. 8 o'clock. 2 of our asset recovery team. Everything in order. Good. I set down the lukewarm coffee. "Is there anything else?" "One more thing," Walter said, and now his voice had something in it that wasn't quite hesitation, but was adjacent to it. "Diana left a 12th voicemail at 12:47. I didn't listen to it. But my contact at the property said that when she got home from Beverly Hills, she sat in her car in the driveway for 40 minutes before going inside. 40 minutes in a driveway. My daughter, who had moved through the world like she owned it because I had let her believe that she did, sitting in a car in a driveway, trying to understand how the ground had shifted beneath her feet. My throat tightened. My eyes stung at the corners. I pressed my lips together and breathed through it. "Thank you, Walter," I said. "That's all for today." I hung up and sat there on the porch as the Florida sun dropped lower over the Gulf side of the island. The water turned from copper to deep rose to that particular purple-gray that happens right before dark. Somewhere on the mainland, my daughter was sitting in a house that had never been hers, holding a phone with 3 declined cards and 14 unanswered calls, trying to figure out what kind of world she had woken up in. I hoped she was scared. Not because I wanted her to suffer, but because fear, real fear, the kind that comes from the ground disappearing, is sometimes the only thing that wakes a person up to what actually matters. And tomorrow morning, she was going to wake up to something else entirely. Walter sent me a photograph at 2:14 in the afternoon. I didn't ask him to. He just sent it the way he sometimes did when he thought a visual would communicate something that a verbal report couldn't. 2 men in Harmon Global logoed polo shirts standing in the driveway of the Newport Beach property, clipboards in hand, a black Lamborghini Urus visible behind them in the open garage. Afternoon California sun on the paint, like something out of a car advertisement. I looked at that photograph for a long time. Then I called Walter. "How did it go?" I asked. Walter took a breath. "Brandon came out before they'd even knocked. He must have been watching from inside." A pause. "He was not pleased." "Tell me exactly." "He came out in..." Walter seemed to be consulting notes. "An untucked dress shirt and bare feet. He told our team there had been a mistake. Team lead showed him the authorization revocation paperwork, which clearly states that the Lamborghini Urus VIN, ending in 4472, is registered to Harmon Family Trust, and that Brandon Cole's temporary use authorization, originally granted in March of 2023, was revoked effective December 1st, 2025. Walter paused. "Brandon told them, and again I'm reading from the incident report, that car is mine. I've been driving it for 2 years. You can't just walk up and take it." I walked to the edge of the porch, looked out at the water, and team lead explained very calmly that under the terms of the original authorization document, which Brandon signed, the vehicle remained trust property at all times, that temporary use authorizations carry no ownership rights, and that the trust was exercising its right to reclaim the asset. He offered Brandon a copy of the revocation paperwork to keep for his records. "What did Brandon do with it?" "Threw it on the ground," Walter said flatly. "Then he called it a..." He cleared his throat. "A word I won't repeat. Then he demanded to speak to the owner of the trust." What did the team lead say? He said the trust owner was not available and that Brandon was welcome to contact our legal department, then gave him Eleanor's office number. Walter's voice had that carefully controlled quality it got when he was suppressing something. Then Diana pulled into the driveway. My stomach dropped an inch. I hadn't anticipated that timing. She saw it happen. She walked in just as our team was completing the vehicle inspection and photographing the exterior. She got out of her car and stood there, and I quote my team lead's report, like someone had hit her with a 2x4. Walter cleared his throat again. She asked what was happening. Brandon told her they were stealing his car. Team lead corrected him, recovering a trust asset per legal authorization. Diana asked to see the paperwork. Did she read it? She read every word, Walter said. Twice. Her hands were shaking so badly, my team lead said the paper was rattling. A pause. Then she asked one question. She said, "Whose trust is this?" Team lead said the trust identity was confidential. And she said, Walter stopped. "Walter," she said, "it's my father's, isn't it?" His voice was quiet. Not a question, a statement. My hand tightened around the phone so hard I could feel my knuckles ache. That sentence hit me in the chest like something physical. Not because she was wrong, because she was right, and I could hear in Walter's telling of it exactly what her voice must have sounded like when she said it. The particular combination of understanding and devastation that happens when a person realizes simultaneously that they were right, and that being right changes nothing. Team lead didn't confirm or deny, Walter continued. Standard protocol. He thanked her for her cooperation, completed the inspection, and drove the vehicle off the property at 2:31 p.m. I stood there listening to the Florida wind move through the sable palms behind the cabin. A magnificent frigate bird, enormous, prehistoric-looking, with a wingspan that seemed architecturally improbable, was riding a thermal above the tree line, tilting its forked tail to steer without any apparent effort. "What happened after they left?" I asked. Brandon went inside, slammed the door hard enough that our team lead heard it from the street. Walter's voice was dry. Diana stayed in the driveway. "How long?" "According to my contact, approximately 22 minutes. Standing next to her car, not getting in, just standing there." I closed my eyes. My daughter standing in a driveway where a car she thought was her husband's had just been driven away in a house she thought was hers, holding paperwork. She now understood meant something she hadn't been prepared to understand. Diana had called me again. 4 more times between 2:30 and 3. I watched each one come in and press straight through to voicemail, and each time it felt like pressing on a bruise, not unbearable but honest. An honest kind of pain. That evening, I walked the eastern shore of the island as the sun went down over the Gulf side and turned the sky ridiculous shades of orange and pink that you only ever see in Florida. The Atlantic on my left was calm, dark green, patient. I thought about what Walter had told me about Diana standing in the driveway. I thought about Brandon throwing paperwork on the ground and calling my asset recovery team, a word I didn't need Walter to repeat to figure out. I thought about a man who had spent 2 years driving a vehicle he had signed a document acknowledging he did not own, and who had somehow convinced himself in that time that possession was the same thing as entitlement. I thought about how I had made that possible. Not Brandon's character that was his own work, but the environment in which his particular variety of entitlement had been able to grow unchallenged. I had built the greenhouse. I had controlled the temperature. I had no business being surprised by what grew inside it. Walter called again at 7:15. "One more thing," he said, and I could hear in those 3 words that this was the thing he had been holding back all day. Brandon made a call this afternoon, after the team left. He called a private number, not the trust, not Eleanor's office. "Who did he call?" "A private lender," Walter said carefully. "Based in Scottsdale. One we've seen before in our industry, the kind that specializes in high net worth borrowers, who need fast capital without involving traditional banks. Everything in me went very still. How do you know this? Because the lender's name came up in a background check I ran on Brandon 18 months ago when I noticed some unusual financial patterns in the household accounts. Walter's voice was steady, professional, but I could hear the thing underneath it, the thing that sounded like a man who had been carrying information he hadn't known how to tell me. I should have flagged it to you sooner. I apologize for that. What kind of unusual patterns? Withdrawals and transfers that didn't match his declared income. About the time Coastal Ventures started having its best quarters. Walter paused. I think Brandon may have been borrowing against expected future assets, sir. Against what he assumed he was going to inherit. The frigate Bird had disappeared. The sky had gone dark. The Atlantic was just a sound, now patient and constant, and utterly indifferent to the plans of men who borrowed money against other people's futures. How much? I asked. I don't have that number yet, Walter said, but I'm working on it. I said goodnight to Walter and sat in the dark on the cabin porch for a long time, listening to the ocean, thinking about the particular kind of person who looks at someone else's 40 years of work and sees it primarily as something to borrow against. Somewhere out there, Brandon Cole was making phone calls. And somewhere else in that Newport Beach house, Diana was sitting with the paperwork from this afternoon, and the voicemails I hadn't returned, and the growing understanding that the ground beneath her feet was not what she had thought it was. I wondered which of them would crack first, and what Diana would do when she found out what her husband had been planning with her inheritance behind her back. By Tuesday morning, Diana had stopped calling and started planning. Walter told me this with a hint of something that might have been admiration if he allowed himself such things professionally. She made 4 outgoing calls between 8 and 9 a.m., he said when he checked in that morning. None of them to your number. That I thought was progress of a kind. Painful progress. But progress. I was on the eastern shore of the island with my coffee and my Steinbeck, though I hadn't read more than 6 pages in 2 days, because I kept staring at the Atlantic instead. The morning was clear and warm in the way that only coastal Florida manages in December, the kind of weather that feels almost apologetic about being so beautiful when the rest of the country is gray and cold. Who did she call? I asked. An attorney, not Eleanor, a different one who apparently told her that trust structures in California are entirely legal and that she had no standing to challenge the occupancy review without more information about the trust's stated intentions. Walter paused. She called the county assessor's office to try to get ownership records on the property. They told her the public record shows Harmon Family Trust, LLC, as the registered owner, and that trust membership information is not part of the public record. Good. And then she called the private investigator. Another pause. Ray Mora. He runs a firm in West Hollywood. Background investigations, asset location, missing persons. He has a solid reputation. I set down my coffee cup on the porch railing. How solid? Solid enough that I'd have hired him myself if I needed someone, Walter said, which from Walter was a significant endorsement. He's found people who didn't want to be found before. Tracked assets hidden through much more complicated structures than yours. A beat. He's going to give her a run for her money. At least at first. At first, I repeated. The island is airtight, sir, Walter said, and there was a quiet confidence in his voice that I had spent 19 years learning to trust completely. FAA no-fly zone filed and approved 3 weeks ago standard procedure for private island properties in the Keys. The security patrol boats operate in international waters protocol. Anyone approaching within a half-mile perimeter gets hailed and turned around. Nothing illegal. Everything properly permitted. Mr. Mora is good, but he's not going to walk through walls. I looked out at the water. My water now. 47 acres of it plus the surrounding buffer. I had not bought this island to hide. I had bought it because I needed space to build something, and because I needed the world, specifically one part of the world, to understand that I was not sitting in a hotel room somewhere waiting to be found. I was somewhere intentional, somewhere that required effort to reach, somewhere that would only open its doors when I decided they should open. Walter called again on Thursday afternoon. Mora made his approach yesterday, he said. Chartered a boat out of Marathon Key. Our patrol intercepted him approximately .4 miles from the eastern shore. He identified himself, explained he was conducting a welfare check on behalf of a family member. A pause that had a slight smile in it, if Walter's pauses could be said to have expressions. Our security lead told him the property owner was in good health, was not in any distress, had not requested any contact, and that if Mr. Mora attempted to approach again without prior authorization from the owner, they would be required to contact the Monroe County Sheriff's Office. Did he push back? He asked if he could leave a message for the property owner. Walter cleared his throat. Our lead said he could write a letter and mail it to the trust's registered address in Los Angeles, same as anyone else. I laughed. An actual laugh out loud alone on a porch in Florida. It surprised me. I hadn't heard that sound come out of my own chest in a while. Mora called Diana that same afternoon. Walter continued the professional neutrality back in full effect. My contact says she took the call inside the house, and that when she came back into the front room, her face was white as a sheet and her hands were shaking. I stopped laughing. What did he tell her? I asked, though I already knew the substance of it. Essentially what I just told you, Walter said. That the island is registered to a private LLC, that the owner is confirmed to be present, and unharmed, that the property has legitimate and thorough security measures, and that there is no legal basis to compel access or contact. A pause. Mora apparently told her, and I'm paraphrasing here, that whoever owns that island has gone to considerable lengths to be inaccessible, and that if she wanted to reach the owner was going to have to decide to let her. On the other end of the phone, I heard Walter draw a breath, not his usual efficient inhale before the next item. Something more deliberate. She cried, he said quietly. My contact said she sat in that car in the driveway and cried for 20 minutes after the call. The words went through me like a cold current. My daughter crying in a driveway in Newport Beach because she couldn't find her father. Because the man she had told to pay rent or leave had made himself unreachable, and now the unreachability felt like something other than strategy. It felt like loss. My jaw tightened. My eyes burned at the corners, and I blinked it back hard. Walter, I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended, scraped over something. That's enough for today, of course. His voice was gentle. Sir, for what it's worth, I think she's starting to understand that this isn't about the house. I held the phone against my ear long after the call ended, looking at the Atlantic, thinking about a girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder on long car rides. Her hair smelling like the strawberry shampoo Maggie always bought, her small hand curled trustingly in mine. Then I thought about where she was going to look next when looking for me from the outside didn't work. And I thought that when she finally looked inward at herself, at her company, at the life she had believed she had built on her own, what she found was going to hurt far more than a declined credit card or a driven-away car. That part wasn't mine to stop. Walter started sending me daily reports on coastal ventures the second week of December, not because I asked him to, because he knew the way he always seemed to know what I needed before I asked for it, that what happened to Diana's company in the coming weeks was going to matter not just to her financially, but to the question at the center of everything I had set in motion, the question of what she had actually built, and what had been built for her. The first report came Monday the 8th. 3 clients had notified Coastal Ventures of non-renewal. No stated reason. Just standard end-of-contract notice, the kind of language that lawyers write specifically to be unassailable. Walter's note at the bottom read, "All 3 are long-standing Harmon Global affiliate partners." Contracts with Coastal Ventures originated through introductions I facilitated personally in 2019 and 2020. I read that line twice. Then I set the report down on the porch table and looked at the water for a long time. By Friday the 12th, the number was 8. Walter called that evening. "She's noticed," he said. "How bad is it?" "She called an emergency meeting with her CFO this morning." He paused. "Marcus Webb, 44 years old, good man, been with Coastal Ventures since the beginning. Honest. Maybe too honest for what Diana was hoping to hear." "What did he tell her?" Walter took a breath. "That's where it gets complicated. Marcus found something in the audit that he wasn't expecting. Something that—" He stopped. "Walter." My voice was steady, but the muscles in my jaw were tight. "Tell me." "The funding anomaly he found," Walter said carefully. "He traced it. $14 million over 8 years, routed through 4 separate limited liability companies with generic names: Pacific Flow Holdings, Coastal Bridge, LLC, Meridian Freight Partners, Harbor Lane Capital. Each one dissolved after its transfers were complete. Each one traced back eventually through layered ownership records to Harmon Family Trust. The ocean in front of me was perfectly calm. I had arranged those transfers with Eleanor 8 years ago, shortly after Coastal Ventures nearly collapsed in its second year of operation, when Diana's primary client pulled out without warning. I had watched my daughter work 18-hour days trying to hold that company together, watched her believe she was doing it through sheer force of will. And I had made a decision then not to hand her the money openly, which would have undermined everything she was building in her own mind, but to create a quiet floor beneath her invisible support that kept the structure from collapsing while she fought her way up. I had told myself it was love. Sitting on that porch, I understood it had also been cowardice. "What did Diana say when Marcus told her?" I asked. "She didn't say anything right away." Walter's voice was careful. "Marcus said she sat very still for about 30 seconds, which apparently is unusual for her. Then she asked him to pull up the full client list, every major contract Coastal Ventures had held in the past 5 years. He did. She went through it line by line." A pause. "She started putting check marks next to the names she recognized from Harmon Global's partner network. By the time she got to the bottom of the list, she had check marks next to 63% of the revenue. 63%. Then she asked Marcus the question," Walter said quietly. "Which question?" She said, "Marcus, if we remove the $14 million from our financial history, and we remove every client that came through Harmon Global Connections, are we a viable company?" I pressed my hand flat against the porch railing. The wood was warm from the day's sun, rough-grained real. I pressed hard enough to feel the grain against my palm. "What did he say?" My voice came out barely above a level tone. I had to work to keep it there. Walter was quiet for a moment. "He said, 'No, Diana, we're not.'" The words landed like something dropped from a height. 3 words. The honest answer to an honest question, delivered by a man who clearly cared enough about Diana to tell her the truth, even when the truth was going to shatter something she had spent 8 years believing about herself. "How did she take it?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "She thanked him," Walter said, and his voice had something in it I couldn't quite name. She said, "Thank you, Marcus, that's all for today," and she walked out of the conference room. A beat. He said she made it to the elevator before her legs gave out. She had to put her hand against the wall to stay upright. I turned away from the water. My chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with my 68-year-old heart, and everything to do with the father part of me that had never fully made peace with watching his child suffer, even when the suffering was necessary. "She built real things," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. "Diana is smart. She works hard. None of that was a lie." "No," Walter agreed. "It wasn't. But she built them on a foundation she didn't know existed. And now she knows." I thought about what it must feel like to stand in an elevator lobby with your hand against the wall, the architecture of 8 years of identity rearranging itself all at once. To realize that the building you had been so proud of was real, the craftsmanship was real, the effort was real, but the ground it sat on had been quietly laid by someone else without your knowledge, without your consent, because that someone else loved you too much to let you fail, and not enough at the time to let you learn. Walter, I said, "Sir, tell me something honestly. Did I do the right thing 8 years ago, with the money?" There was a pause that felt different from Walter's usual processing pauses. This one felt like a man deciding how honest to be with his employer of 19 years. "I think," Walter said finally, "that you did it for the right reasons. Whether it was the right thing." Another pause. "I think that's between you and Diana. And I think it's a conversation that's going to happen eventually." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Eventually," I said. "Not yet." "No," Walter agreed. "Not yet." After I hung up, I sat on that porch until the stars came out over the Atlantic, enormous and indifferent and ancient, the way stars are when you need reminding that your particular set of mistakes, however painful, are not the center of the universe. Diana had lost her self-image today. Not her potential, not her intelligence, not the years of real work. Just the story she had been telling herself about where she came from and what she had earned. That story had needed to break. What she built next that would be hers. Before I reveal what those 3 demand letters actually said, and trust me, the number will shock you, drop a "still here" in the comments right now, so I know you're still with me. Every single comment means more than you know. A small note. This story carries some fictional elements woven in for depth and meaning. If that's not something you'd like to continue with, this is a good place to step away, no hard feelings at all. The 2 weeks between December 19th and Christmas were quiet ones on the island. Quiet. In the way that the eye of a storm is quiet, a stillness with consequence waiting on every side of it. Walter's reports came in shorter during that stretch. Coastal Ventures had gone into a kind of stunned suspension after Marcus Webb's audit, Diana apparently spending her days in the office going through contracts one by one with the particular focused desperation of someone trying to save a building they've just realized is on a flawed foundation. Brandon had been making himself scarce around the house according to Walter's contact, coming in late, going out early, his phone perpetually pressed to his ear in the driveway. I knew what those phone calls were. Walter had told me 2 weeks ago. The private lender in Scottsdale. $2.3 million. Brandon Cole betting his entire future on an inheritance that was never his to claim. I had been waiting for the letters to arrive. They came on December 21st, a Sunday. Walter called me at 10 in the morning Florida time while I was reviewing architectural sketches for the first residential building on the island's northern plateau. He didn't say hello, he just said, 3 demand letters arrived at the Newport Beach property this morning via courier. All 3 lenders, all 3 calling the loans due. I set down the sketches. At the same time, Brandon had a balloon payment structure on all 3 loans, lump sum due on demand if certain financial conditions were not met. The condition on all 3 was continued access to the Harmon Family Trust credit facilities. Walter's voice was precise and measured the way it always was when he was delivering information he knew was going to land hard. When those facilities were canceled on December 1st, it technically triggered the default clauses. The lenders gave him 3 weeks to cure. He couldn't. So this morning, all 3 sent simultaneous demand letters. I pressed my hand flat against the table. Outside, the Atlantic moved the way it always moved without asking anyone's permission, without explaining itself, without caring even slightly about the human dramas playing out on its shores. How much total? I asked, though Walter had told me before. $2,300,000, he said. Due within 30 days or they initiate collection proceedings. Brandon Cole had borrowed $2.3 million against the expectation of inheriting my life's work. Not Harmon Global's assets. Not the trust properties. My 40 years. My metal box under the bed in Queens. The years Maggie and I didn't take vacations and didn't buy new clothes and didn't go to restaurants because every dollar had somewhere more important to be. He had looked at all of that and seen a down payment on his own ambitions. "Walter," I said, and my voice came out very quiet and very flat. "How did Diana react?" A breath. "She was at the house when they arrived. She opened them in the front hallway." Walter paused. "My contact says she read all three without stopping. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to press the papers against the wall to hold them steady." I closed my eyes. I could see it. My daughter standing in a hallway that wasn't hers, reading letters that proved the man she had married had been quietly dismantling their future without ever telling her why or how much or with whose money he had been doing it. "Brandon came downstairs while she was reading," Walter continued. "She held up the letters without saying anything. He apparently turned gray. Just the color went out of his face completely. He tried to speak first. He said, 'Diana, I can explain. I thought we were going to,' and she cut him off," I said. "Not a guess. I knew my daughter." "She cut him off," Walter confirmed. "She said, 'You borrowed against my father's money, money you assumed was coming to you, money you treated like it was already yours, before the man who built it had even left the room.'" A pause. Then she said, "Get out of my house." Something cracked open in the middle of my chest. Not grief, exactly. Something more complicated. Something that was pride and sorrow twisted together so tightly they felt like the same thing. "He argued," I asked. "He argued," Walter said. "He said it wasn't her house to throw him out of." Which is technically true, but it was not the ideal moment for that particular observation. A brief pause that contained the ghost of what might have been dark humor if Walter permitted himself such things on the clock. Diana told him that in that case he was welcome to call the trust's legal department and request a formal occupancy review. Then she opened the front door and stood next to it. He left," Walter said. "2 suitcases in 20 minutes. The contact said Diana stood at the door until his rental car. His rental car because his own was already gone until it turned out of the driveway and disappeared. And then she closed the door, slid down the back of it, and sat on the floor of the entryway and cried until she couldn't breathe. My throat locked up so completely I couldn't speak for a moment. My daughter. Sliding down a door onto the floor of a house that wasn't hers alone on the 21st of December, 4 days before Christmas, her company hollowed out her marriage over the man she had trusted with her future, caught borrowing against someone else's sacrifice. "Walter," I managed. "Sir, she's alone in that house over Christmas. Thomas has been checking in," Walter said quietly. "He brings food. She lets him in, which I consider progress." A pause. "She hasn't called your number in 4 days. She stopped after the audit. I don't know what that means exactly, but it feels different from before." It was different. I could feel it from 1,000 miles away. The earlier calls had been panic, the reflex of someone whose safety net had disappeared. These 4 days of silence had a different quality entirely. The silence of someone sitting with something real and deciding what to do with it. I put the phone down and looked at the architectural sketches for a long time without seeing them. Then I picked up the framed photograph of Maggie that I'd brought from Newport Beach and looked at her face laughing in front of that truck in 1991, so young, so certain. "She's starting to figure it out," I told her. "It's going to get worse before it gets better. But she's starting." The photograph didn't answer. It never did. But sometimes in the right light I could swear it looked like she already knew how it was going to end. Eleanor Voss called Diana the morning after Christmas. I know this because I asked Eleanor to make that call personally on a specific date in a specific way. Not through a paralegal, not through a form letter. Eleanor herself, the morning of December 26th, calling Diana's personal number and saying only, "Diana, this is Eleanor Voss. I need you to come into the office today. Alone. There's something your father has asked me to share with you." Eleanor told me afterward that Diana had been quiet for a long moment on the phone. Then she said, "Is he all right?" Eleanor said, "He's fine. This is a legal matter." Another pause. Then, "I'll be there at 10. She was there at 9:47. Eleanor called me after the meeting, sitting in her office in downtown Los Angeles, with the Pacific visible through her window. And she walked me through every minute of it in the methodical, compassionate way that Eleanor handled the hardest conversations directly, without cruelty, without softening anything that needed to be felt at full weight. She came in composed, Eleanor said, well-dressed. She looked tired, but she had herself together. I offered her coffee and she said yes, and then she held the cup with both hands like she needed something to hold on to. I could picture it. Diana with her mother's posture and her father's stubbornness, sitting in a leather chair in a law office 4 days after her marriage ended, holding a coffee cup like an anchor. I told her there was no easy way to present this, so I was going to present it clearly, Eleanor continued. I showed her the date on the will first, November 29th, 2025. 2 days after Thanksgiving, I said. 2 days after Thanksgiving, Eleanor confirmed. She looked at the date and her jaw tightened. She knew exactly what it meant. She said, "He did this right after, not a question." I confirmed it. I had signed that will in Eleanor's office on a Saturday morning, 2 days after the dinner. 2 days after I had already set everything else in motion. Some people might call that impulsive. Eleanor had tried to suggest I wait. I had told her that I had been thinking about this particular document for 2 years, and that Thanksgiving had not changed my mind, it had only clarified my timeline. I walked her through the structure, Eleanor said. 40% to the Veterans Hope Foundation, which I explained is a charitable trust you are establishing specifically to fund the Island Resort Project. 35% to James Harmon Jr., a sharp intake of breath on Eleanor's end, as she described Diana's reaction. She said, "James, Thomas's son." I confirmed. She said he was 8 years old when I last paid any attention to him. I didn't respond to that. I let her sit with it. "Good," I said quietly. Then I told her about her portion, Eleanor continued. 25% of the total estate with a conditional bequest structure. The condition being that she demonstrates financial independence, meaning income and assets accumulated without the use of Harmon Family Trust resources or Harmon Global connections within a 3-year period from the date of my death. If the condition is not met, her portion reverts to the Veterans Hope Foundation. A silence on Eleanor's end. She asked me to repeat that. I imagine she did. I repeated it. Then she said very carefully, "What's the legal basis for a conditional bequest like that?" I explained that conditional bequests are fully enforceable under California Probate Code, provided the condition is not contrary to public policy, does not require illegal action, and is reasonably possible to fulfill. Eleanor paused. She said, "It's possible to fulfill. He knows that. He knows I can do it." Her voice cracked on the last word. My own chest tightened. I gripped the edge of the porch table with one hand and breathed. Then she asked about James, Eleanor said. She asked why. Specifically, why him? Why 35%? Why a 26-year-old engineer she barely knew? I gave her the note you wrote. I had written 4 sentences. I had rewritten them 11 times before I got them right. They said James showed up every Sunday. For 30 years, his father was the most consistent presence in my life. James is what loyalty looks like when it has no expectation of reward. She read it twice, Eleanor said. Then she folded it very carefully and put it in her jacket pocket. Her eyes were red and wet, but she didn't let them spill over. She pressed her lips together and breathed through it and sat up straighter. That hit me somewhere deep and particular. Maggie used to do exactly that. Press her lips together. Breathe. Sit up straighter. Diana had never known she carried that habit. She asked one more question before she left. Eleanor said. She said, "Does he know where I'm living? Does he know what's been happening?" I told her you were kept informed. She nodded. Then she said, Eleanor paused, and her voice had something in it that was not professional detachment. She said, "Tell him I understand why. I don't like it, but I understand." I turned away from the window. Outside, the Florida afternoon was doing its brilliant, indifferent thing, with the light turning the water into hammered gold. And I stood there with my back to all that beauty, and pressed my fist against my mouth, and breathed through the thing that was happening in my chest. She understood. She was 38 years old, and she had just lost her marriage and her company's identity. And now her expected inheritance in the span of 5 days, and she sat in a lawyer's office and said she understood. Maggie, you should be here for this. You should be here to see who she is when the comfortable version of herself is gone. Eleanor, I said when I trusted my voice again. Richard, when she's ready to reach out, if she reaches out, I want to know immediately. Of course. A beat. Richard, for what it's worth, and I've been doing this for 22 years, so I think it's worth something. She's going to be all right. What I saw in that room today wasn't someone who was broken. It was someone who was beginning. I stood there for a long time after Eleanor hung up, watching the light move on the water, thinking about a 26-year-old named James Harmon Jr., who had grown up coming to work with his father on weekends, who had eaten at our kitchen table more times than I could count, who had never once in his life asked me for a single thing, and who had, without knowing it, been teaching my daughter through his very existence what showing up without an agenda actually looked like. She was beginning. I hoped she knew how much I was rooting for her. The new year came quietly on the island. No fireworks, no countdown. Just the Atlantic at midnight doing what it always did, and me on the porch with a glass of bourbon I barely touched, watching the dark water, and thinking about a woman who had pressed her lips together in a lawyer's office 6 days ago and said she understood. Walter called on January 2nd, with news I had been half expecting. She reached out to Eleanor, he said. Asked if it would be possible to arrange a meeting with James Harmon Jr. Eleanor called James. James agreed. They're meeting this afternoon at Eleanor's office. I set down the bourbon. How did she sound when she called Eleanor? Eleanor said she sounded like someone who had made a decision and was following through before she lost her nerve. Walter paused. Her words. I thought about that for a moment. Diana picking up the phone to call a lawyer's office and ask to meet a 26-year-old man she hadn't paid attention to since he was a child, because she needed to understand something she couldn't understand any other way. That took a specific kind of courage. The kind that doesn't feel like courage from the inside. It feels like desperation wearing courage's clothes. But it gets you to the same place. Eleanor called me that evening and described the meeting, the way she always described things precisely without editorializing, letting the details carry the weight. James was there when Diana arrived, Eleanor said. He stood up when she came in. He's tall, Thomas's build. Diana stopped in the doorway for a moment when she saw him. I think she was recalibrating. He's not a boy anymore. What did she say to him? She walked straight over and shook his hand and said, James, thank you for coming. He said, of course. And then they sat down and Diana looked at him and said, I need to ask you something directly. Did you know about any of this? And he said no. I found out the same week you did. Eleanor's voice was measured. Diana's shoulders came down about 2 inches. I watched the tension go out of her like air from a tire. Then she asked the hard one, I said. I knew Diana. Then she asked the hard one, Eleanor confirmed. She said, Are you going to take it, the 35%? Are you going to accept it? James thought about it for a genuinely long time. Diana didn't rush him. Finally, he said, I don't know yet. I think the answer to that depends on what your father intended. And I think the only person who can answer that honestly is him. Something warm moved through my chest at that. The boy had his father's wisdom. Then Diana asked something I didn't expect, Eleanor said. She said, What was he like, my father? What was he like when you were around him? Because I realized recently that I don't actually know. I gripped the porch railing. James told her about the Sunday phone calls, Eleanor said. How your father had called Thomas every Sunday evening for 30 years just to talk. How you had shown up to every one of James's school events that Thomas mentioned sitting in the back so you wouldn't make it about yourself. How you had read James's college thesis and sent back 6 pages of handwritten notes. A pause. Diana's eyes filled up completely. She blinked hard twice and pressed her knuckle against her mouth, but one tear got through and she wiped it away fast like she was angry at it for escaping. That image gutted me. My daughter wiping away a tear like it had betrayed her. James said one more thing before he left, Eleanor continued. He said, he talked about you every time. Every single Sunday call, according to my father. He always said you had your mother's mind, and that he was afraid he'd made things too easy for you. Eleanor's voice softened. Diana said, I know that now. And she meant it. I could tell she meant it. 7 days later, on January 7th, Diana vacated the Newport Beach property. Walter sent me a photograph. Not a dramatic one. Just Diana standing on the front step, with 3 bags of luggage, the door closed behind her, the morning sun coming over the hills. She was wearing jeans and a jacket I didn't recognize, not the designer pieces I was used to seeing on her. Something practical. Something bought for being in, not for being seen in. Her chin was up. Her eyes were dry. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and everything to do with the specific exhaustion of a person who has stopped pretending. I looked at that photograph for a very long time. My throat ached. My eyes stung. And underneath all of that, something that felt uncomfortably, unexpectedly like hope. She locked the door. She handed the key to the trust representative Walter had sent. She picked up her bags without help and walked to the car she had rented with her own credit card, her own immodest visa she'd had since graduate school, that she had apparently never canceled, and she drove away without looking back at the house. Not because it didn't hurt. I knew it hurt. But because some doors, once you've decided to close them, you close them and you keep walking. I had taught her that. Not on purpose. But I had taught her that. I didn't check in much on Diana during January. That was intentional. Walter understood without being told. His reports that month came in shorter, less frequent, the kind of updates that said she's fine, she's moving, without hovering over every detail. I had watched my daughter closely enough for the past 6 weeks. What she needed now was room. Room to discover what she was made of when no one was watching, when no one was subsidizing, when the safety net was gone, and the ground was whatever she could build it to be. But Walter still sent the photographs. I hadn't asked him to stop. I wasn't strong enough to ask him to stop. The first one came on January 10th. Diana walking out of a coffee shop in Santa Monica, backpack over one shoulder, travel cup in hand, dressed in clothes that were clean and put together, but carried none of the deliberate statement that her previous wardrobe had always made. She was wearing flat shoes. Her hair was pulled back simply. She looked like a woman going to work. Not a CEO, not a Harmon, just a woman going to work. Something in my chest cracked open and flooded with warmth so sudden and intense it startled me. Walter called on January 15th with an update. She's been applying for positions, he said, under the name Diana Cole. No mention of coastal ventures in her cover letters. She's describing her experience in functional terms without the company name. Operations management contract, logistics, vendor coordination. A pause. She was declined 4 times in the first 2 weeks. How is she taking it? According to Thomas, who she's been letting in for coffee on Sunday mornings. Walter cleared his throat, and I heard the ghost of something almost fond in his voice. She's taking it the way your wife used to take a bad quarter. Head down, jaw set, back to work on Monday. My eyes burned. Lord, she had Maggie in her after all. The 5th application was to Pacific Freight Solutions, Walter said. Small logistics firm in Long Beach. About 40 employees. They handle regional shipping contracts, nothing at the scale of Harmon Global or even Coastal Ventures. The hiring manager is a man named Daniel Reeves, 20 years in the industry, no connection to Harmon Global, no reason to know Diana's last name means anything. Did she get an interview? 2 rounds, Walter said. Daniel apparently told the recruiter afterward that she was the most knowledgeable candidate he'd interviewed for the position, despite having no recent verifiable employment history. He said she knew the operational side of logistics better than people who had been doing it twice as long. A beat. She got the offer on January 28th, operations coordinator, $52,000 a year. I sat with that number for a moment. $52,000. Diana had spent that much in a single month more than once without thinking about it. I knew because I had seen the statements. $52,000 a year was rent and groceries and a Metro card and not much else in the Los Angeles basin. She took the job. Walter sent me the photograph the morning of her first day, January 30th. Diana at a bus stop 2 blocks from her Santa Monica apartment, standing in the pale morning light, with a tote bag over her shoulder and a coffee cup in her hand, waiting for the number 7 bus to Long Beach. The photograph was taken from a distance she had no idea it existed. She was looking down the street for the bus, her chin slightly lifted, her expression focused, and I leaned in close to my phone screen, studying her face in that grainy long lens image, something I hadn't seen on her face in a very long time. She looked purposeful. Not performed purpose, the kind she used to carry into boardrooms like a prop. Real purpose. The kind that comes from having nothing left to prove and choosing to show up anyway. I called Thomas that evening. She let you in Sunday? I asked. Every Sunday, he said, and his voice was so warm it ached. She makes the coffee now. First Sunday she burned it. Second Sunday, it was better. This Sunday she said, Thomas, I've been thinking, did my father ever tell you why he kept working after the company got big? Why he didn't just stop? My breath caught. What did you tell her? I told her what you told me back in 2012, when I asked you the same thing. Thomas paused. I said you told me that the day you stop building is the day you start forgetting why you started. That work isn't about the money when you've already got enough of it. It's about staying connected to the thing that made you real. I had to press my fist against my mouth for a moment. My throat had gone completely tight, and my eyes were burning in a way that had nothing to do with the Florida wind. What did she say? I managed. She said, Thomas replied, his voice dropping to something very quiet and very careful. I think I understand that now. I didn't before. I thought it was just about having things. I didn't understand it was about being something. I breathed through it. The evening light on the water was doing that orange and copper thing again, the Florida sky putting on its nightly show, with complete indifference to the fact that a 68-year-old man was sitting on a porch with wet eyes and a full heart. Thomas, I said when I trusted my voice. Sir, thank you for being there for her. She's Maggie's girl, Thomas said simply. Where else would I be? I hung up and sat in the warm dark for a long time, listening to the ocean, thinking about a woman in a one-bedroom apartment in Santa Monica, who was burning coffee and taking the number 7 bus and earning $52,000 a year and learning slowly and honestly and without anyone holding her up exactly what she was made of. And what I was watching from 1,000 miles away was my daughter becoming herself. It was the most beautiful thing I had seen since the day she was born. Walter mentioned it in his weekly report like it was a footnote. Diana called James Harmon Jr. on Monday, he said. They're having coffee Tuesday morning in Long Beach. I read that line 3 times. Then I set the report down on the porch. Table looked out at the Atlantic for a moment and picked it back up and read it a 4th time. She had called James, not to discuss the will, not to negotiate the inheritance. According to Walter, who had heard it from Thomas, who had heard it from James himself that evening, Diana's exact words when she called had been, "James, this is Diana Harmon. I was wondering if you'd be willing to get coffee sometime. Not about the estate. I have some questions that I think only you can answer." James had said yes without hesitating. I didn't sleep well that night. Not from worry, from something that felt uncomfortably close to anticipation. The way you feel the night before, something important that you've been waiting a long time for. Walter got the full account from Thomas on Wednesday. Thomas had gotten it from James over dinner Tuesday night. And Walter, bless him, wrote it all down in the kind of precise sequential detail that only a man who has spent 19 years understanding that his employer needs complete information could produce. Diana arrived at the coffee shop in Long Beach first. A plain place, no Instagram aesthetic, just good coffee and honest sandwiches and small tables close enough together that you kept your voice down automatically. She was already there when James walked in, both hands wrapped around a mug, her shoulders carrying the particular tension of someone who has rehearsed an opening line and is no longer sure it's the right one. James sat down across from her. He ordered black coffee. He looked at her steadily, Thomas's eyes calm and direct, and he said, "It's good to see you, Diana. You look well." Diana said, "I look tired." James said, "Yes, but you look like yourself. I don't think I've seen that before." Diana stared at him for a moment. Then something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, not quite a laugh. Something that lived in the complicated territory between the two. "That's a strange thing to say to someone you barely know," she said. "My father talks about you," James said simply. "He's talked about you my whole life. So I feel like I know you better than you know me." Diana's hands tightened around the mug. "That's what I wanted to ask you about," she said. "Your father, my father. What was it actually like when they were together, when he came around?" James leaned forward, elbows on the table, and for the next hour, according to Thomas's account of James's retelling, he gave Diana the version of her father she had never had access to. Not the CEO, not the man behind the trust. The man who showed up. He told her about Sunday evenings, how Richard had called Thomas every single week for 30 years, not about business, just to talk. About the time in 2008, when Harmon Global was hemorrhaging money in the financial crash, and Richard had called Thomas not to talk about the company, but to ask how James's Little League season was going. About the time Richard had driven 3 hours round trip to sit in the back of a community college auditorium and watch James give a 10-minute presentation for a class project, because Thomas had mentioned it offhand on a Sunday call and Richard had written it down. "He never told my dad he was coming," James said. "He just showed up. Dad didn't know until he saw him in the back row. He cried on the drive home." James's voice went quiet and a little rough. "My dad doesn't cry easy." Diana's eyes filled up so completely that she had to put her mug down. Her chin was trembling. She pressed her fingers against her lips and breathed through her nose, fighting it, losing one tear breaking free and tracking down her cheek before she caught it with the back of her hand. "He never came to any of my presentations," she said. Her voice cracked right down the middle on the last word. "School plays, debate tournaments. I always looked for him. He was never there. James looked at her with something that wasn't pity and wasn't judgment, something steadier than either. He told my dad once, James said carefully, that he felt like every time he showed up to your things, he made it about him, about what he had given you, and he didn't want to do that to you. A pause. He said your mother always went. He said that was enough. Diana pressed both hands over her mouth. Her shoulders shook once, twice. She pulled in a long, unsteady breath and held it. A second tear escaped and she let that one go, didn't bother chasing it. That's the most infuriating thing I've ever heard, she said, her voice thick and wet and somehow almost laughing. It's the most infuriating and the most… She stopped, swallowed hard. The most him thing I've ever heard. James almost smiled. Yeah, he said, it really is. They sat there a while after that, finishing their coffee, the conversation settling into something easier and more ordinary. James talking about his work in marine engineering, Diana asking questions about the logistics side of maritime freight, with the focused curiosity of someone who genuinely knew the field. Outside Long Beach moved around them trucks on the harbor road, the distant sound of container ships. When they got up to leave, Diana stood on the sidewalk in the thin February sun and looked at James with an expression that I wish I could have seen with my own eyes instead of having to imagine from Thomas's description of it. She said, James, how do I reach him? Not through the trust, not through lawyers. How do I actually reach my father? James thought about it. Really thought about it the way Thomas's family thought about things unhurriedly without filling the space with noise. Write to him, he said finally. By hand. Give it to my dad. My dad will get it to me and I know how to reach Walter. He paused. And Diana, write the truth. He'll know if you don't. Diana nodded. Her eyes were dry now but red at the rims, and something in them had shifted, a quality I recognized even through a second-hand description, the particular clarity that comes after crying hard and deciding to keep going anyway. She said, thank you, James, for coming, for telling me. James said, he's worth fighting for, so are you. Diana walked to her car. James watched her go. And somewhere in that exchange, without anyone planning it, the bridge that had been burned at a Thanksgiving dinner in November began quietly and improbably to have its first new plank laid down. Walter brought me a sealed envelope on the morning of February 14th. Not by mail, in person. He had flown into Key West the night before and taken the early morning boat out to the island, something he had done exactly twice in the 3 months I had been here, both times, for matters that required his physical presence. When he handed me the envelope on the porch, his expression had the careful neutrality of a man who understood precisely what he was carrying and had chosen to treat it accordingly with both hands, as if the weight of it were more than paper. Thomas gave it to James on Sunday, Walter said. James gave it to me Wednesday. I thought this one deserved to be hand-delivered. The envelope was cream-colored standard letter size. My name on the front in Diana's handwriting, not the efficient printed letters she used for business correspondence, but the rounder, slightly uneven cursive she had written in as a girl before professional life sanded everything personal down to utility. The seal on the back was pressed closed with what looked like her thumb, no wax, no formality, just closed. I held it for a long time. Do you want me to give you some space? Walter asked. Stay, I said. Please. I don't know exactly why I wanted him there. Maybe because Walter had been present for so much of this, had carried information back and forth across 1,000 miles. For 3 months, had done it with loyalty and without judgment, and it felt right that he should be present for this part too. A witness. The way Thomas had been my witness at the courthouse in Queens in 1986 when I married Maggie. My hands were unsteady when I broke the seal. I noticed that and was not ashamed of it. At 68 years old, after everything a man is allowed unsteady hands. The letter was 7 pages handwritten on both sides of the page, the ink slightly smeared in a few places where the pen had moved faster than the paper dried. 7 pages. Diana, who communicated in bullet points and executive summaries, had written 7 handwritten pages. I read every word. She did not start with an apology. She started with a description of her apartment in Santa Monica, the way the morning light came through the kitchen window at 6:45. The sound of the number 7 bus outside that she had learned to time her departure around the fact that she had burned coffee 3 Sundays in a row before Thomas told her she was using too much grounds. She wrote about her first week at Pacific Freight Solutions, about Daniel Reeves, who had called her out in her first team meeting for an error in a routing calculation, and then stayed 20 minutes after everyone left to walk her through how to fix it, because he said that was how his first boss had treated him. She wrote about eating lunch alone at her desk for the first 2 weeks, because she did not know how to be a person among equals rather than a person at the top, and how on day 15, a woman named Carol from Accounts Payable had sat down across from her without asking and put half her sandwich on Diana's desk and said, "You look like you haven't eaten a real meal in a week." And how Diana had almost cried right there in the break room because no one had done something that simple and that kind for her in longer than she could remember. My throat was locked so tight by that point I had to stop and breathe for a full minute before continuing. Then she wrote about the apology. Not the general sweeping kind. The specific kind, the kind that can only come from someone who has spent weeks alone with their own honesty. I'm sorry for what I said at Thanksgiving. I'm sorry for the way I said it, and the audience I chose to say it in front of which was not an accident, even if I told myself it was. I wanted to feel powerful in front of people, and I used you to do it. And I have thought about the look on your face when I said those words every single day since you walked out of that room. I pressed my fist against my mouth so hard my teeth cut into the inside of my lip. I'm sorry for every dinner where I talked about my success without once asking about yours. For every time Brandon said something about earning things, and I nodded along because it made me feel like we had earned them. For never asking whose name was on the deed. For never asking where the money in Coastal Ventures actually came from. For treating your generosity like it was the natural weather of my life, just something that happened, not something a person chose over and over, because they loved me. Walter was standing at the porch railing with his back to me, looking out at the water, giving me what privacy he could in a small space. I was grateful for that. My eyes were burning so badly, I could barely read the last page. She did not ask for anything back. Not the house, not the cards, not the company, not even the inheritance. She wrote near the end, "I'm not writing to ask you to undo any of it. I think I needed every single piece of it, even the parts that broke me. Especially the parts that broke me. What I'm asking for is smaller and larger than any of that. I'm asking if I can come see you. Not as your heir, not as your business problem, just as your daughter who has been missing her father for 3 months and has only recently understood that she was missing him long before he left." And then, at the very bottom of the last page in letters that were slightly larger than the rest, as if she had pressed harder with the pen, "I love you, Dad. I always did. I just forgot to act like it. I won't forget again." I folded the letter. My hands were shaking so badly, the pages rattled against each other, the sound loud in the quiet Florida morning. I held the folded letter against my chest with both hands and tipped my head back and breathed at the sky, and the burning in my eyes finally won, and I let it, because some things deserved to be felt at full volume. Walter turned around. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "Sir." "She can come," I said. My voice came out wrecked and completely certain. "Tell Thomas to tell James to tell Diana she can come. First week of March." Walter nodded. He pulled out his phone. Then he stopped and looked at me again with an expression I had never seen on his face in 19 years, something unguarded, something that had nothing to do with quarterly reports, or asset recovery, or trust administration. For what it's worth, he said, Maggie would have loved this part. I laughed. A real one, loud and sudden and slightly broken at the edges. It startled a brown pelican off the dock railing and sent it banking out over the water in an offended arc. Yeah, I said, wiping my face with the back of my hand. She really would have. Thomas called me the Sunday evening after Diana visited. It was the last Sunday of February, and I was sitting on the porch with the architectural drawings for the second residential building, spread across the table in front of me, a pencil behind my ear, and a cup of tea gone cold at my elbow. When his name came up on my phone screen, I felt something tighten pleasantly in my chest, the way it always did when Thomas called that particular warmth of a friendship so old it had become structural load-bearing, the kind you don't notice until you try to imagine the building without it. She came today, he said without preamble. I set down the pencil. How long did she stay? 4 hours, Thomas said, and something in his voice, a fullness, a slight roughness at the edges, told me everything I needed to know about the quality of those 4 hours before he said another word. He told me she had called ahead, politely, a little formally, the way Diana still defaulted to formality when she was nervous. She had said, Thomas, this is Diana. I was wondering if I could come visit you sometime soon, just to talk. Thomas had said Sunday was fine, come for lunch. She arrived in her rented car at 11:45, carrying a box of pastries from a bakery she had clearly researched because it was Thomas's neighborhood, not hers. She was wearing jeans and a blue sweater, the same flat shoes she had been wearing since January, her hair loose. Thomas said she stood on his front step with the pastry box held in both hands and looked at the modest house, the neat garden, the small porch, the wind chimes. Lucinda had hung 15 years ago that he had never taken down, and something moved through her face that he couldn't name precisely. She said, I've never been here before. Thomas told me, his voice careful. I said, no, you haven't. And she said, I should have come a long time ago. And I said, yes. But you're here now. My throat tightened. I pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of my nose and breathed. They sat at his kitchen table. Thomas made coffee, real coffee, the kind Diana had been learning to make herself on Sunday mornings. She ate 2 pastries and told him that was more sugar than she normally allowed herself, but that she had decided recently that life was too short for the kind of discipline that doesn't leave room for croissants. Thomas laughed at that, a real laugh, and Diana's face lit up in a way he said he hadn't seen before, open and unguarded, the way a person looks when they laugh, because something is genuinely funny, and not because it's socially useful. Then she asked him to tell her about my father, not about Harmon Global, not about the trust or the will or the properties, about Richard Harmon, the man. What was he actually like day to day when the cameras weren't rolling and the quarterly reports weren't due, and there was just a person moving through an ordinary Tuesday? Thomas told her things that hit her like physical objects, one after another. He told her about the year 2008, how I had refused to lay off a single employee during the financial crisis, how I had sold a commercial property in downtown Los Angeles at a catastrophic loss to make payroll for 6 months, how I had never once mentioned it to anyone except Thomas, who had only found out because he had processed the paperwork himself. Diana put her pastry down on the plate and said, he sold a building to keep people employed. Thomas said, 42 families. Diana pressed her hand flat on the table like she needed something to hold on to. He told her about 2015, when Thomas's own cancer diagnosis had come in on a Thursday morning. How I had shown up at the oncologist's office on Friday afternoon, uninvited, with 2 cups of coffee, and had sat with Thomas through a 3-hour appointment, during which Thomas had been told the treatment would be brutal, and the odds were not comfortable. How I had driven him to chemotherapy every single Thursday for 6 months. How on the last Thursday, when the doctor said the scans were clear, I had sat in the parking lot with Thomas for an hour, and neither of us had spoken much, just sat there in the car together, until the shaking in Thomas's hands had finally stopped. Diana's eyes were overflowing by then. She wasn't trying to stop it anymore. Tears were tracking freely down both cheeks, and she was letting them go. Her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, her breath coming in slow, deliberate pulls. "He never told me any of this," she said, her voice barely holding together. "Not once. Why didn't he ever tell me?" Thomas looked at her steadily. "Because your father doesn't do things so people will know he did them," he said. "He does them because they need doing. There's a difference. A big one." Diana wiped her face with the back of her hand hard, like she was angry at herself for crying, and grateful for it at the same time. "I know that now," she said thickly. "I really finally know that now." Then Thomas stood up and went to the bookshelf beside the fireplace. He came back with a photograph in a simple frame. He set it on the table in front of Diana. I knew the photograph. I had one myself. Maggie had taken it with a disposable camera in the spring of 1991 outside the depot in Secaucus, New Jersey, where we had parked the third truck the day we took ownership of it. Thomas and I, 27 and 28 years old, standing in front of that cab in the late afternoon light, grinning like idiots. Neither of us had a gray hair. Neither of us looked like we had any idea what was coming. Both of us looked like we were exactly where we were supposed to be. Diana picked up the photograph with both hands. Her fingers were trembling. She stared at it for a long time, and I could imagine exactly what she was seeing: her father, young and alive with possibility, laughing at something beside his best friend, in the pure, uncomplicated joy of a man who is building something real. "Your mother took that picture," Thomas said softly. "She'd just driven out to meet us because she wanted to see the truck. She said she wanted to remember what 28 looked like on your father's face." Diana made a sound that was half sob and half laugh, a broken, beautiful sound that Thomas said filled the kitchen like something alive. She pressed the photograph against her chest, both arms wrapped around it, and held it there. "Can I keep this?" she whispered. Thomas said, "I made a copy years ago. That one's always been for you." When Diana left, Thomas walked her to the car. She put the photograph carefully on the passenger seat, buckled it in like a person, and then turned and hugged Thomas, a real one, both arms, face against his shoulder. The kind of hug Thomas said lasted long enough that he had time to clear his throat twice, and still she held on. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were red and swollen, and she looked more herself than she had in years. "Thomas," she said, "thank you for taking care of him when I didn't." Thomas put his hand on her shoulder and squeezed once. "Go take care of him now," he said. "That's all he ever wanted." He called me 20 minutes after she drove away. His voice when he told me all of this was the steadiest I had heard it in a long time. "She's ready, Rich," he said. "She's really ready." I looked out at the ocean. The evening light was doing that impossible Florida thing, with the water turning it every shade of gold. "I know," I said. "I know she is." I was on the dock at 7 in the morning when the boat came in. I had been awake since 5. By 6:15, I gave up pretending I was going to do anything useful and walked down to the eastern dock, sat on the wooden bench at the end of it, and watched the Atlantic go from black to dark gray to deep blue. My heart was doing something undignified for a 68-year-old man, beating too fast, too insistent, the way it does when your body knows something important is coming, before your brain gives it permission to acknowledge it. The boat came around the northern point at 7:12. I stood up. My knees were unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with age. I saw her before she saw me. Diana was standing at the bow, one hand on the railing, watching the island come into view. Work boots, real ones. Gray jacket. Hair loose in the sea breeze. She looked thinner than I remembered. older in ways that had nothing to do with years, and her face as the boat drew closer shifted visibly from careful composure to something rawer and more honest. Because what she saw was not what she expected. No resort, no infinity pools, no private paradise. A construction site exposed concrete foundations, steel framing, rising against the morning sky. Lumber stacked under blue tarps, 3 pickup trucks near the tree line, 12 workers already moving at 7 in the morning. I watched Diana's hand tighten on the railing as she took it all in, her father 68 years old, standing at the end of a dock, in a work flannel and steel-toed boots with sawdust on his sleeve. The boat bumped against the dock. She stepped off. We were 10 feet apart for the first time since November 28th, when she had stood in the kitchen doorway of the Newport Beach house and watched me walk away. 4 months, 2 weeks, and 6 days. She stopped 3 feet from me, chin up, jaw set, eyes red at the rims but absolutely direct. "Hi, Dad," she said, voice rough as gravel, solid as bedrock. "Hi, sweetheart," I said. She closed the last 3 feet, and I put both arms around her, and she pressed her face into my shoulder and held on the way she hadn't since she was 7 years old. The construction crew did us the profound kindness of being very loud and very busy and paying us no attention whatsoever. Her shoulders shook once. Then she pulled a long, deliberate breath and steadied herself. I walked her through the site slowly, the way you let a thing speak for itself before you explain what it's going to be. She walked beside me, not behind me. Asked real questions, technical ones, the kind that told me 4 months at Pacific Freight had built something in her worth keeping. When I showed her the layout plan, 50 rooms, a dining hall, therapy facilities, an adaptive sports court, she studied it for a long time. "Who is it for?" she asked. "Veterans," I said. "Elderly people with no family. People who gave everything and got forgotten. It'll be completely free forever as long as the endowment holds." Diana looked up from the blueprint. Understanding and grief and something like recognition moved across her face in quick succession. "Forever is expensive," she said. "I know," I said. "That's why I built the last 40 years first." That evening we ate at the small outdoor table on the western side, grilled fish, garden vegetables, bread from the mainland. The Gulf turned pink and orange as the sun dropped. Diana ate everything on her plate and asked good questions the whole way through. The questions of a person who was genuinely present. After dinner, she asked quietly, "Why veterans specifically?" I thought about Thomas sitting with me in a parking lot after his all-clear scan. I thought about 42 families who kept their jobs in 2009 because I sold a building. I thought about what it costs to be forgotten by the people you gave the most to. "Because nobody shows up for them," I said. "Because they gave everything and received nothing back." I paused. "And because I understand that feeling now in a way I didn't before." Diana's eyes went bright and wet. She blinked it back hard. "Dad, I'm so—" "I know," I said. "I know you are." She pressed her lips together and nodded. We sat in the warm Florida dark with the Gulf moving around us and the last light dying on the water. And for the first time in 4 months and 2 weeks and 6 days, something felt put right. Not fixed, not erased, put right. There was still a conversation we hadn't had, the real one. We both knew it. We would have it tomorrow. Tonight was enough. Tonight, my daughter was here. Not for the money, not for the inheritance, not for anything she could carry back with her in her luggage. She had come for me. That was everything. She was already on the beach when I woke up. I made 2 cups of coffee and walked down to the eastern shore. Diana was sitting in the sand, with her knees pulled to her chest boots, beside her, staring at the Atlantic. The early morning light came flat across the water and turned everything silver. I sat down and handed her a cup. "I've been out here since 5, she said. "I figured. What have you been thinking about?" She turned the cup slowly in her hands. "I had this whole speech prepared. 3 weeks of writing and rewriting it." She made a short, rough sound. I got out here and none of it felt right anymore. That's usually a sign the prepared version wasn't the true version, I said. She laughed, short, startled, then her face went serious again. I don't want the speech, she said. I want to just say it. She pulled in a long breath. What I did at Thanksgiving was cruel, not thoughtless cruel. I chose that moment and that audience deliberately. I wanted to feel in control of something, and I used you to do it. Her voice cracked. She pushed through it. I have thought about the look on your face every single day since you walked out of that room. I am sorrier than I know how to say. My throat tightened so hard I could barely breathe. I kept my eyes on the water. There's more, she said. Tell me. I spent 8 years believing I had built something. Her voice went harder and more honest. I believed it completely. And it turns out I was standing on a floor you built without telling me, in a house you owned, driving a car that was yours, spending money I never once questioned. She stopped. Her jaw worked. I'm not angry. I'm ashamed that I never asked. That I made it easy not to ask because I didn't want to know the answer. She was holding herself completely upright, the dignity of someone who has decided to feel the full weight of a thing rather than let it knock them down. One tear broke loose and tracked down her cheek. She didn't touch it. I missed you, she said. Not the house, not the money, not the title. I missed my father. For years before you left. I didn't know how to say that, so I just got louder. Built things and called them success so I wouldn't have to feel how much I missed the person who taught me what building even meant. Then she stopped fighting the tears entirely. Her shoulders shook. Her hands gripped the coffee cup. Her face was completely open and unguarded in the morning light. I put my arm around her. She turned into my shoulder and cried the way a person cries when they've been carrying something for a very long time and finally put it down. I held on. My own eyes burned so badly the horizon had gone blurry. When she finally steadied, she pulled back and looked at me. Okay, she said quietly. Your turn. I looked at my daughter, red-eyed, salt-cheeked, more fully herself than I had ever seen her. Diana, I never wanted to punish you, I said. Not one single thing I did was about punishment. The house, the car, the cards, the will, all of it was designed to ask you one question, the only question that mattered. I held her gaze. When everything was gone, the money, the status, the title, would you still come find your father? Or would you only come back when there was something left to claim? Her lips pressed together so hard they went white. You came, I said. My voice broke, and I let it. You wrote the letter. You went to Thomas. You sat with James and asked about me, not about what I had. You came to this island with nothing but yourself. I let that sit between us. That was the whole answer. That was everything. Diana grabbed my arm with both hands and pressed her forehead to my shoulder, her whole body shaking. You could have just asked me, she said, voice broken and muffled. I know, I said, chin resting on top of her head, eyes on the Atlantic. But you wouldn't have known the answer yet. You needed to find out for yourself first. The sun came fully up. Construction sounds drifted down from the plateau, truck doors, voices, equipment starting up. The good, busy sound of people building something real. Diana lifted her head. Face a complete mess. Absolutely beautiful. Can I stay? She said. Not as a visitor. I want to help build it, whatever that means. I looked at her. I looked at the water. I looked back at her. Do you know anything about construction? I asked. The corner of her mouth moved. Just barely. Just enough. Not a single thing, she said. But I learned fast. You taught me that. I stood up and held out my hand. She took it. I pulled her to her feet, and we stood together in the Florida morning, the ocean in front of us, the work behind us, 40 years of everything between us. Come on then, I said. I'll introduce you to the crew. Diana stayed for 3 weeks. Then she went back to Los Angeles, handed in her notice at Pacific Freight Solutions. Her manager told her she was the best operations coordinator he'd hired in a decade, packed 2 pairs of work boots, and came back to the island for good. March became April. April became May. Diana learned construction the way she learned everything, by getting it wrong first and refusing to get it wrong the same way twice. She misread a structural drawing and cost us 2 days of rework. That evening, she came to me with a full account of what had gone wrong and exactly what she would do differently. I listened, nodded, and said nothing, because that was precisely how Maggie and I had handled our own mistakes in the early years, and it had worked then, too. In the evenings, we talked. Really talked. Long, wandering conversations about the project, about Maggie, about Queens, about what Diana had understood growing up and what she understood now. Some nights we talked until the stars were full out over the Atlantic and the coffee was long cold. Some ended with both of us laughing until our eyes watered. Some ended with the quiet fullness that only comes after saying something true that has waited far too long to be spoken. Thomas called every Sunday. I always handed Diana the phone. July arrived, and with it the first 15 rooms completed. The day we opened the gates, I stood back near the tree line and watched. Diana stood at the entrance in her work clothes, the flannel shirt she had borrowed from me 3 months ago, and clearly decided was hers now, and she shook every hand. She had memorized every resident's name, service history, and medical needs before they arrived. She had put fresh flowers in every room herself that very morning. Harold came in the 3rd group, 79 years old, Vietnam veteran, former ironworker from Pittsburgh. He walked with a cane and wore a pirate's cap so washed out it had gone from black to gray. Diana walked him to his room personally. She opened the door. Clean lines, good light, a window facing the water. Harold stood in the doorway for a long time. His chin was trembling. "Is this really mine?" he whispered. "For as long as I want it." Diana looked at him with the most open, clear expression I had ever seen on her face. The same expression I had seen on Maggie's face, on Thomas's, on the faces of people I had trusted most. "For as long as you want it," she said. "This is your home, Harold." Harold pressed his lips together, put one hand over his eyes, and let himself cry without shame. My own eyes burned so badly I had to look away. November, Thanksgiving. Diana made the turkey this year. She had been practicing since September. It was the best I had eaten since Maggie's last Thanksgiving in 2019. The table was small. Thomas and James argued cheerfully about maritime navigation. Walter smiled more than I had seen him smile in 19 years. Harold told Diana about the 1979 World Series in such detail that she could probably have called the games herself. At some point, Diana looked at me across the table. No special reason, just looked and said quietly, "Thank you, Dad, for all of it, even the hard parts." I put my hand over hers. "Thank you for showing up," I said. "That's all I ever needed." Outside, the Atlantic moved steadily. The island was full of light and voices, and the particular good noise of people who have found somewhere safe. Somewhere in that warm Florida evening, I thought I could feel Maggie watching. I think she was pleased. If there's one thing this long journey taught me, it's that love without wisdom is just kindness wearing a blindfold. I gave Diana everything, and in doing so, I nearly taught her that everything could be taken for granted. It wasn't until I stepped back that she finally stepped forward. Someone once told me, and I believe God places certain seasons in our lives not to punish us, but to prune us so something truer can grow. That Thanksgiving night, when Diana's words cut through the dinner table like cold glass, I didn't fight back. I just started building quietly in the dark, the way old men do. These are the kinds of grandpa stories I never thought I'd have to tell. But here we are, and I'm glad I did. Don't be like me. Don't wait until a holiday dinner falls apart to start the honest conversation with your family. Don't let comfort replace connection. Don't assume the people you love most already know how much they're truly worth to you. I waited too long, and it almost cost me my daughter. In my opinion, wealth without character is a house with no foundation, and a child who earns nothing learns nothing. Every family story worth telling has a chapter of loss because that's what makes the chapter of return so beautiful. These grandpa stories aren't just mine. They belong to every family that has ever loved imperfectly and tried anyway, because that's what a real family story is: messy, painful, and worth every scar. If this story touched your heart, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share it with someone who needs it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Thank you so much for staying with me all the way to the end. It truly means the world. A gentle note before our next story: some upcoming tales contain fictional elements crafted purely for reflection and inspiration. If that's not your cup of tea, no hard feelings. Feel free to explore other content that speaks to you. But if you're staying, I promise it'll be worth it.